Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha and we're continuing with Swami Kriyananda's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. We are starting chapter 2, stanza number 70. We are almost at the end of chapter 2. 270. Contentment is his who, like the ocean, calmly absorbs into himself all the rivers of desires. One, on the contrary, whose desires trickle outward, as if from a pond, is soon drained of energy. Well, it's a very simple and vivid image, isn't it? The image of the river seeking the sea has so many different beneficial ways of thinking about it. I tend to think of it primarily as the inevitability of the individual soul ultimately merging with the ocean, and the fact that no matter how meandering or convoluted our course, it is the nature of the river to seek the sea, and it's the nature of the soul to seek God, even though at times we appear to be rushing madly in the opposite direction. Nonetheless, there's a far deeper longing that is always within us. That we'll talk about that at the very beginning of the next chapter of the Gita, if we get to it today or next time we have a recording here. And then, by contrary, one whose desires trickle outward, the way he says that, just trickle outward. And it's a very vivid image. Sometimes the image is used if you have a bucket that is full of holes, then no matter how much you put into the bucket, everything will always come sprouting out of those holes, and there's just no amount of, you can't get ahead of it. So there's always two aspects to directing our lives in a spiritual way. One is what we're bringing in, and the other is how much and in what ways the energy is leaking out. When I've given classes on the chakras, which is in itself a really interesting subject, on the YouTube channel there's a 4-part course on the chakras, which apparently is quite effective, just judging by the comments I've gotten over the years. But in it I talk about the fact that we tend to talk about chakras being blocked. It's a whole subject in itself, which I won't go into here except just to refer to it. The energy is rising upward from the base of the spine to the spiritual eye. And we talk about it not being able to rise because at certain chakras, the chakras are on a spectrum. There's many ways to think about it, but in this context, from focus on outwardness to focus on an inward reality as the primary reality, touching the point between the eyebrows, meaning the individual self in attunement with the higher self, the ego, which is represented by the medulla, transferred to the positive pole of that same chakra, which is the spiritual eye. And we say the chakra is blocked, and therefore the energy can't rise, which is a way of saying it, and it is true. But to my way of thinking, a more vivid way of describing it is that the energy leaks out at the chakra. There's a leak in the chakra, rather. And so instead of the energy just rising in a smooth wave upward to the spiritual eye and circulating in an interior way and thus becoming magnetic and strong, the energy is spent in what I can only call a horizontal direction. And so instead of having our energy determined and guided by our attunement with our spiritual self, each chakra acts on its own level in an outward way, because every chakra you see has an inward and an outward dimension. Every chakra is good. The qualities of every chakra are essential for the balanced expression of our destiny. But each of those qualities that each chakra represents can either be lifted upward and act in harmony with our best higher interest, or the energy can be dissipated on a lower, a more materialistically oriented level. For example, the first chakra represents our need to be steadfast and determined and loyal. It also represents our need for security. And of course, the need for security is a fundamental human need that everyone is seeking. So do we seek our security in our absolute knowledge that we are children of God and that our lives are being guided and directed from a higher source? And that would be to take the desire for security and elevate it through the chakras and attune it with our awareness of God's presence in our lives, which is the spiritual eye represents. Or we take that desire for security and we spend it in the most obvious materialistic way, which is, in order to feel secure, I need a home, I need a secure job, I need a pension, I need a lot of money in the bank, I need possessions, I need people to depend on. And one may, in fact, acquire all of those things in the course of living out your karmic destiny, but one either does them with an awareness of God acting through us, an awareness that our only true security is God, or one does them horizontally, so to speak, and clinging to the earth element as the source of our security. The third chakra is fiery self-will, and that can either be expressed as a determination to master our impulses that take us away from the light and direct our energy upward toward attunement with God, or it can be used to try to dominate the world and make it do what we want it to do. And so all of these qualities, each one, I could go through all of them, but I do that in the other courses. But that's how our energy, and he uses the word trickle, that's how it trickles out. We're on our way to be attuned with God, but along the way we try to get security or love or sexual energy or variety in our lives or self-expression or whatever it might be. But instead of harmonizing it with God, we just spend it as the impulse arises. And so if you literally think of the energy circulating through the chakras up and down, when you do Hong Sa, you're thinking about the energy in the spine. Much more deeply when we do Kriya, we're circulating the energy through the chakras up and down the spine in the practice of Kriya. And the reason we're doing that is because we're trying to create a strong inward magnetic field. And so when you circulate the energy up and down with conscious will, which is a part of the practice of Kriya, what we're creating is a magnetic force within us that draws all the energy inward with great power and allows us to direct it from the higher chakras instead of just having it trickle out. And if you think about people that you know in your life, or even if you watch your own self in different circumstances, you realize that people who are able to accomplish a lot, you feel their power at the center of themselves. And people who aren't able to accomplish very much, you sort of see them. They may have lots of energy, but you can almost see it as a physical, almost as a visible reality, that their energy is just going out in all directions. Such people are physically restless. They often have a very short attention span. They tend not to listen to what other people are saying. They tend to, often they talk more at you than with you. Their thoughts will flit from thing to thing. They have a necessity to always be entertained. I know this is naive of me, and this is going to sound so incredibly cliche, but I live, especially in more recent years, I live a very quiet life in a very real sense, and I tend to move in an Ananda world. I'll probably be moving into a more public phase again, but for several years I've really enjoyed a lot of seclusion and not a very public life. So just yesterday I've been working on the costumes for our school play. Almost every year I spend about 6 weeks at this time of year, which is February and March, making the costumes for the 70 children, not sewing them, but assembling them and thinking about what they're supposed to be. Trust me, this is not a high-level design project, but we have to create a costume somehow for each child out of existing materials or a few things that we make. The end point of all of it, I'm walking through the local shopping center, and I mean, of course, it couldn't have been a better place. I don't know whether it was Google or what it was, but in our area, there are these commuter buses for the tech companies, because a lot of people live up in San Francisco and they come down here. So they have these big buses that pick people up and take all the tech workers up to wherever they are. And so there was a whole busload of people, or a whole, what would be a busload of people waiting for the bus. And surprise, surprise, every single one of them had their little phone out and was looking at it. And I know it's cliche, but it was comical, because there were just a big crowd of them. No one was talking to anyone else. No one was looking at the sky. No one was holding a book in their hand, although I think one person might have been holding a Kindle. But almost all, and who knows what they were doing, were holding the box in their hand and looking at it. And it occurred to me, and there's nothing wrong with it. I myself have a cell phone, and I look at it often. I check my emails. I do what everybody else does on it. But this constant outward looking of our energy, this constant drain of our energy, rather than being full and content in ourselves. And this is what I was saying about, I mean, some of those tech workers are highly concentrated, very capable people. So the mere fact that they're holding cell phones in their hand didn't mean anything in that respect. But the point I was trying to make is, when people have power, you feel that power, because their energy does not trickle out. Wherever it goes somewhere deliberately and with self-control. And that's what we're trying to accomplish in our lives. Our goal is God realization, but the capacity to concentrate on anything and not have our energy constantly be dissipated by distractions. I missed a plane once I was in Rome. I was trying to get to Jerusalem. It was a very weird 3 days of karma, and I missed 2 planes that time. I think I've missed 3 planes in my life. That was 2 of them. One of them was not, well, they were all my fault in a certain sense. But anyway, the second one that I missed was really wild, because when I sat down at the gate, facing the gate, as I always do, and I was in plenty of time, there were these huge video screens that were just like right there in front of me, and they were not even playing television, they were playing advertisements. You know, and advertisements move so fast, and the light was so strong, I turned my back on it, because I just couldn't sit in front of it. I was actually working. I was doing some editing or something like that. So I turned my back on the screen. I was right at the gate, but I turned my back on the screens and went to work. And, well, I'll just finish the story since I started with such a weird cycle of karma. I was paying attention. I had a watch on. I was paying attention, and when it was time to board the plane, I turned around, and they were closing the gate. I don't mean just closing the door. They were, the stewardesses were leaving the gate. Everything was finished, completely finished. I was totally like, looking at my watch. What is this? And I kind of ran over to some information place, and I was a little frantic. I was not centered, because the whole cycle of time was weird. Anyway, to make a longer story short, it turned out that the battery on my watch was dying. But instead of my watch stopping, it slowed down exactly 45 minutes. Just long enough for me to miss the window of opportunity to get on the plane. And I guess I was concentrating on the work so much I just believed my watch. At that point, I just threw up my hands and realized that I was not going to get where I was going until God wanted me to get there. And it did take a little of the angst out of it. But the reason I turned around was because I just couldn't believe that the flashing lights of that screen, because it just completely threw my energy field off. I mean, that's more than a trickle. So the reason I'm talking about all this is, and this is if we get to the 3rd chapter, or as soon as we get to chapter 3, it starts with the question of, why do you have to fight? And we have enough internal realities that are influencing us and making spiritual progress difficult. But these are not congenial times. I mean, everything in our time militates against the kind of concentrated upward movement of consciousness that is the only way to God realization. So we have to recognize this is the battle of Kurukshetra. This is, excuse me, I think I'm going to sneeze here. One of the costumes I'm making for the children is a little mouse costume for the kindergartners. And, you have to make a costume that's entirely indestructible for kindergartners. And I've been refining this over years, and I thought I really had it this time. It won't itch, it's really comfortable, and it's indestructible. And now it sheds. It's sort of like the gods just laugh at us when we try to work. So this thing sheds all over the place. So I spent much of the afternoon trying to do things so it wouldn't shed. But as a result, I think I breathed in a lot of the mouse fuzz, as we're calling it lovingly. So I'm hoping that was the last sneeze for today. But anyway, moving right along. What we have to realize is there's a tremendous force that's pulling us outward. And we have to pay attention. If we just drift along, it won't necessarily take us directly to the sea. That's the point that I only need to make. Swami also talks about how he said some yogis recommend complete indifference to the world. He describes that, Swami, as what a dry outlook. Master instead taught to enjoy with God the beautiful things of this world. You see, it's not how we relate to the world per se. It's how we relate first to God and then how we relate to the world. If there's no upward focus to our reality, if we're not thinking of ourselves in relation to a greater reality, then every involvement in the world just takes our energy. But if everything that we do in the world is in relation to that greater reality and attuning ourselves to it, Swamiji says, generous desires to help others, desire to experience uplifted joy, those are the desires that are directed to merging with the sea. So it's a mistake to think that the way that we bring ourselves to God is to become, as he calls it, dry in our outlook. Swamiji was just so enthusiastic. He found joy in everything, and it was just the joy bubbled up out from him, and so wherever he was and whatever he was doing, he was able to bring to that experience, this experience of joy. This is going to be so silly, but in a very real sense, it was very real. When we were in the middle of the 12 years of litigation that afflicted Ananda, 2 different lawsuits brought by an attempt by another religious organization to have a monopoly on Master's teachings. It was an arduous, it was a very expensive cycle of time, and not all the experiences we had were pleasant. And often we'd have to go either to Sacramento or to Los Angeles to have these unpleasant experiences. And there was a legal team of about 7 or 8 of us, and a few attorneys and Swamiji, and it was a big deal. And it went on for years. It cost us millions of dollars. And in the end, it all happened just as it was meant to. But when we were in the middle of one of those days, and I believe we'd gone to Los Angeles for like a 3 or 4 day cycle of unpleasant experiences, and we had flown home, and I believe we had flown back, and we were stopping in a restaurant to have some lunch. And there were 6 or 7, and I don't know how many of us there were at that time. And I looked over at Swami, and we'd ordered, and they'd brought some a bread to the table, a crisp white loaf, there's a word for it, baguette, to the table. And I looked over, and Swami was staring at the table with great concentration. And when I looked at him, he was doing something with his thumb. And what he was doing was there were dry crumbs that had come off of the bread that were now on the white tablecloth. And Swami was pressing on the corner of a crisp crumb with his thumbnail, and when he did so, the crumb would jump a certain distance. And so he began doing it, and then we all began doing it. And we started having a small competition to see who could develop the best technique, the best crumb jumping technique, to push the crumbs the farthest. And before we knew it, I mean, we were all engaged in what could only be called as a completely ludicrous project. But it was so ludicrous, and it was such a pleasant contrast to what we'd been through that in a very short period of time, our good spirits were restored, and we were laughing again. And for years after that, we often joked about the crumb jumping, and even just being able to bring up the crumb jumping to show how low we had sunk, in our creativity and our intellectual abilities in the face of all that we were facing. But it makes me laugh to think about it. It made us laugh for years and years, just even to remember it. Now, there was nothing funny about it, except Swamiji brought to it his state of inner joy. And no serious conversation at that point would have been joyful. So he just looked around God's universe to find something that was a way of channeling it. I hope you understand what I'm saying. It's not that we were always silly, but Swamiji was quite comfortable being silly if that was what was appropriate. But the joy we felt in doing it was a reflection of the joy of God. You can enjoy anything, well, and everything, once you have the joy of God. And then everything is the river going to the sea, and nothing is the pond being drained, if you understand what I mean. And that's what we're working for. We always have to look to the example of the saints. Swamiji often said, when they speak of Jesus as a man of sorrows, and some traditions say that Jesus was so conscious of the sufferings of the world that he never smiled. Swami says that's nonsense. No one would have followed such a man. He said, one who just stood there and wept for your sins and sighed mightily over the sorrows of the world. Who would want to spend time with such a person? You go where you feel uplifted and where you feel joy. Jesus was a man of enormous joy. He had to be. That's what gave him the courage and the capacity to face into the difficulties he had to face, was that his inner reality was different from that. I have to say that of all my years of knowing Swami Kriyananda, which was more than 40 years, it's like what was so extraordinary about him was the portable paradise of happiness that he carried inside himself. No, he was not always joking and laughing. Many things that happened were too serious for jokes. But there was always underneath it this consciousness of the power and presence of God, which was uplifting and joyful. And that's what the spiritual path is all about. That's what it is that we're trying to do. And that's the antithesis of having all your energy just drain out and, watching video commercials while you wait for an airplane. It's just we always have the opportunity as the only opportunity. The only opportunity that we always have is where we direct our attention. And yes, some things will really compete for our attention. There's no question about that. It's the battle of Kurukshetra. That's what the whole Bhagavad Gita is. It's not an effortless stroll, but it's the only effort that's worth making, because everything else sooner or later will evaporate, and we'll be left only with our consciousness. So who we are is really our true wealth. Well, number 271. That person knows peace who, relinquishing all energy-draining desires and fully satisfied with his state of desirelessness, no longer sees himself as a separate individual ego. This is where the spiritual path gets really interesting. As you see, if you watch this program not as a podcast but on YouTube, and you see me week after week, you'll see that I'm always dressed in blue. If you look at very old programs before 2009, you'll see that I wore a variety of colors. But in 2009, Swami Kriyananda started the Nayaswami order, and in November of that year, I was part of the first initiation he gave, which by a beautiful divine coincidence was 40 years almost to the day, perhaps even to the day, because I'm not sure of the exact date, to the first time I saw Swami Kriyananda, and the first time I thought that I really wanted to have his consciousness. By no means did merely taking sannyas make me him, but it was very gratifying to realize that an intuition that I had in a split second when I first saw him, had borne such wonderful fruit in my own personal life. Part of the Nayaswami vow is I no longer exist as a separate entity, but offer myself into thy great ocean of awareness. And that line has both inspired and amused me. It's a good joke. I no longer exist as a separate entity. There's many odd situations in life when it's a fun thing to say. But in fact, when those of us who were being initiated for the first time were all together in Assisi, Italy, or at least 10 of us were, 11 of us, we had a big van that we were driving around in, and we were talking about our upcoming vow. And we were saying that, sometimes a particular species has a word for a group of them, a flock of geese or a gaggle of geese or whatever it might be, and there's others that I can't remember right now, but specific species have specific words. So we decided, we're asking, well, when you have a group of Nayaswamis together, what do you have? And based on I no longer exist as a separate entity, we decided a group of Nayaswamis constitutes a void because there's no one there, or at least ideally. But what Swami is saying here, that person knows peace who no longer sees himself as a separate individual ego. Now, this is where words get very complicated, because individuality is still there. And you must understand also that one does not lose consciousness. People think if I no longer exist as a separate entity, separate individual ego, then I no longer exist. But it's more like if you're a window and the sunshine is shining through you, the sunshine will still shine through you when the window realizes that I am not the source of the light that seems to emanate from me. I'm merely the clear window through which that light expresses, but as a window, I really have no reality at all. In fact, the more clear I am, the more perfectly the light comes through. So what we identify with is not the form through which that infinite is expressing, but the infinite that is expressing. And it may come through the shape of who we are. We have responsibility for it. It gets very subtle. But I no longer exist as a separate entity, but offer myself into the great ocean of awareness. And that's when we have perfect peace. Because then we are finally, there's no stress-producing counter effort to the ocean flow, the river flowing to the sea. The river is just going to flow into the sea, and there's no little eddies of whirlpools. There's no rocks in the road. There's no obstacles to overcome. There's no nothing. It's just, the river just flows to the sea. Just like that. The energy doesn't trickle out. It just goes exactly where it's intended to go. And that's when the state of peace sets in, as long as we're trying to hold a little of it back. And the mere preservation of that meanness, I-ness, holding myself separate. It's been so amusing to me. I saw this more in relation to Swami Kriyananda, although I've experienced it a little bit myself, directed toward me. But when people would compliment Swamiji on something he would do, and he would say, well, Master did it through me, or God is the doer, or, various things that he might say, which to him, it was not an affirmation. He was just making a simple statement of fact. But then I would watch people try to insist that he take personal credit. Yes, God may have been the doer, but he had to have an instrument. Somebody had to be willing. And Swami might try to counter it for a moment, but then he would just let it stand. He didn't have to affirm his unity with the divine. It was so established in his consciousness that he didn't have to defend it. But I would sometimes just marvel at how determined people were to get Swami to acknowledge some separate egoic existence when he was just calmly and completely repudiating it. When we would marvel sometimes at his accomplishments. Or actually, let me think, I'll tell you a specific incident when someone said, of all the things that you've accomplished, of which of your accomplishments are you the most proud? Swami's answer was, what accomplishments? Much has been done through me, but I have accomplished nothing. And he would tell us, and we would marvel at the prodigious creativity. And he would just say, well, you just attune yourself at the spiritual eye and let God act through you. And he would make a strong point of it. He would often sort of make a list of all the things that had been accomplished through him. And some people didn't understand. They thought it was ego on his part, but it was just the opposite. It was that which I do, ye shall do in greater things, which is what Jesus says in the Bible. Be ye therefore perfect, even as our Father in heaven is perfect. And that which I do, ye shall do in greater things. Because we all have exactly the same potential to be perfect instruments of God. We diminish that potential because we let our energy drain out like little streams from a pond instead of dynamically directing it and from the spiritual eye and allowing God to act through us. This no longer sees himself again as a separate individual ego. Swami said, the ego lies at the root of all delusions. And once the ego is the infinite self identified as with the limited self. I mean, that's what ego is. It's not an evil thing. It's just a mistaken sense of identity. And if we shift our identity from the limited to the infinite, then it's the global solution to everything else. Because all our suffering, all our anxieties, all our lack of fulfillment is this misguided effort to find our fulfillment by affirming and identifying with that limited reality. You see, and it's a very subtle game that God has set up here, because it appears to us that if we satisfy those individual desires, then we'll satisfy the underlying longing of our hearts and souls. But the fact is that underlying longing is for the river to merge with the sea. And as long as we hold on to that individuality to that extent, we can't merge with the sea. So we hold on to our separateness and to our little desires, hoping for that fulfillment. But the paradox is, it's that very clinging that prevents us from that holds us back from that fulfillment. So when I no longer exist as a separate entity, but offer myself into thy great ocean of awareness, then all of it is solved. We don't have to deal with every little individual delusion. It's just all washed away. Now, in theory, one could do that in one swell whoop. In fact, it's the battle of Kurukshetra. It's quality by quality, day by day. But if we understand, the battle gets very simple. It's devotion to God and a relinquishment of self. I won't say more now. Number 272. O Partha, which is one of the names for Arjuna, Krishna says, O Partha, Arjuna, this state is known as Brahmisthiti, absolute oneness with the infinite. Anyone who achieves this state will never again fall into delusion. Even at the moment of death, if one concentrates wholeheartedly on this state, he attains perfect, eternal bliss. Isn't that a beautiful promise? This is it. This state of he no longer sees himself as a separate individual ego. Once that realization comes, you have it. Once you know it, it's just who you are. Once we realize, that's why the word is realize. Because just once you know it, you simply know it. It becomes self-definition. It's no longer a glimpse or an effort. It just becomes a fact. And then in the commentary, Dr. Lewis asked Master the question, if you have to repeat the whole process of realization with every day and night of Brahma, these are these very long cycles of time in which creation is manifest and then withdrawn, and then manifest again and then withdrawn. Earlier in these commentaries, I believe it was in these classes, it might have been in the conversations classes, forgive me if I'm confused, where Master said some souls that are manifested at the beginning of the day of Brahma are still wandering in delusion at the end of the day of Brahma. So Dr. Lewis asked the question, do we have to rise and fall and rise and fall? And Master said, no. Once freedom is attained, you have it forever. And on that extraordinary promise, the second chapter, The Nature of Right Action, of the Bhagavad Gita ends. So, now we're in chapter 13 of Swamiji's book, which is only chapter 3 of the Bhagavad Gita. So chapter 3, stanza 1. Arjuna then speaks to Krishna. O Krishna, the divine liberator, if, as it seems, you consider understanding superior to action, why have you been urging me to this terrible action? Now reminding you that the Bhagavad Gita is one chapter of the Mahabharata. And the Mahabharata is the story of the Battle of Kurukshetra. And the Gita takes place on the eve of this battle after endless adventures, which is a wonderful story in itself. But after endless adventures, Arjuna finds himself on the battlefield and he has to go to war, siding with his brothers, fighting against his cousins. And Arjuna hesitates to take up his weapon and engage in this battle. And the whole Bhagavad Gita is the dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna as to why it is necessary to fight. So the fight is literally this historical battle between the two factions who are fighting for the kingdom, the Kauravas and the Pandavas. But the Battle of Kurukshetra is our field of consciousness. And the inner question is, why do I have to struggle? If God is my own reality, if I am made in the image of God, if my union with God is inevitable, why do we have to struggle? Why is the spiritual path such an effort? And Arjuna says, if the whole point is just to recognize that this world is a dream and that all effort is futile and all we have to do is just become one with the infinite, why are you telling me to engage in this war with my cousins? What's the point of the kingdom? What's the point of killing all these people? So it's the questions asked on multiple levels, all of which apply to us. Why participate in the world? Why strive for success? Why work for excellence? What is the point? If it's all just God anyway, and in the end it's just a dream and doesn't matter, why don't I just sit back? Good question. And it's very useful to realize that even Arjuna hesitated. So when we ourselves find ourselves either confused or reluctant or unable to put our full energy into it, all of these things, we have to realize that even Arjuna said to God, why are we doing this? What's going on here? I find that very comforting. And I'm sure that's one of the reasons that the whole story is told, is that this is what happens to devotees. I have had to fight a battle for, I guess, self-worth is what you would say. I mean, everybody fights that battle, to be at ease inside my own skin. And, part of that is harsh judgment against oneself, false, unrealistic expectations, and then upset. You set yourself an impossible goal, and then you fail to reach it, and then you're upset with yourself for not reaching it. It takes a long time to realize that if you continually set an impossible goal, you get to fail every time. I remember when I just finally had to realize that I wasn't that good. It was a very comfortable feeling. I was having a discussion with a friend about this recently, and I was remembering a friend that I was trying to help through a similar cycle. And I said she was doing the same thing. She was constantly setting an impossible goal for herself, failing to reach it, and then falling into a depression because she'd failed to reach an impossible goal. And finally, she was able to hear what I was trying to share with her, which is, I don't know how to break the news to you, but you're not that good. You're just not good enough. You're not going to get the gold medal. You're just not that good. It's an objective reality. And if you say every time, I don't get the gold medal, therefore I'm a total failure, but you aren't capable of getting the gold medal, it's just an impossible dilemma. And I said, you're really a wonderful person, but how about this as a mantra? I'm entirely adequate. Or if you prefer, you can say you're barely adequate. And she got the joke. She understood what I was trying to say. And she just tried to bring her self-image closer to her actual reality. And then very cheerfully she went around saying, I'm adequate. I'm just completely adequate. And the ludicrousness of it helped her break the habit of trying to be a gold medalist when really she was a solid bronze. She was a very solid bronze. But she was never going to be gold. It just wasn't going to happen. Not in this lifetime. Do you understand what I mean? It's like absolute meditation schedule, absolute kindness, never having that extra pint of ice cream, always doing your kriyas with complete concentration. I just make a long list. Never losing your temper. I mean, yeah, be nice, but it's not possible for most of us, not yet. And if we build from our current reality, we have a much better chance. Well, all of this I was saying about Arjuna and this whole thing being a situation where everything is set for Arjuna to fight this battle, but he hesitates. And he hesitates. It just, as old devotees, we hesitate. We want it with a large part of ourselves, and then another part clings. It just clings. So I always feel good if Arjuna had to stop the show for a while and have a conversation with God. It's all right for me to do the same. And I was going along this theme, which I know I've repeated many times, but it's been a lot. It has been a struggle for me, and I know it's a struggle for a lot of people. But my mantra became very simply, I'm very sincere on the spiritual path. And sincerity is a place I could always stand. I might not be good at the spiritual path, but I'm very serious about it, and I'm very honest about it. This is not a show I put on for someone else. I do this because this is who I am. So, if this is what happens to sincere devotees, if this is what happens to me, this must be what happens to sincere devotees. If this behavior comes through me, doesn't mean I'm proud of it, but it doesn't mean I have to be ashamed of it either. It's just what happens when you're sincere on the spiritual path. If I could have done better than this, I would have done better than this. If I could have transcended this desire without having to live through it, well, I would have. But apparently I've had to live through it. I remember Swamiji once, well, in my own life too, he sees karma coming, and he'll make a suggestion. And the suggestion is based on he sees the karma coming, and he's kind of hoping that maybe he can guide you around it, but a lot of times he can't. You just have to live through it. I've just had to live through it. But the fact that he encouraged me to go around it actually helps me, when the inevitable day of judgment comes. And I remember that Swami saw it coming. And that actually helps me, because he saw it coming. It's a little bit like, and I don't want to elevate my little experiences to this level, but it's the same principle. When Peter, just before Jesus was crucified, when they were at the Last Supper, and Jesus was hinting, I'm going to go somewhere where none of you can follow. And he was hinting at what was about to happen, because within hours he was going to be arrested and by the next day crucified. They were celebrating the Passover in Jerusalem, and the disciples had the impression that, this was the beginning of Jesus ascending to the great throne of majesty that they perceived in him and that he himself spoke of, but many of them thought it was an outward victory, not an inward one. So he had, at the Last Supper, he was beginning to hint at the change that was about to happen. And so he said, I'm going to go somewhere where none of you can go. And Peter, who was a very outspoken, strong disciple, said, Lord, wherever you go, I'll go with you. There's no place you can go that I wouldn't follow you. And then Jesus said to him, really? I mean, I'm paraphrasing. Jesus said, really? He said, before sunrise, before the rooster crows, before the cock crows, he said, you will deny me 3 times. You will deny that you even knew me. And Peter was, never, Lord. But then, in fact, when Jesus was arrested and taken away and was suddenly being mistreated and put in front of the council of priests, and the disciples just didn't know what was going to happen, 3 times someone said to Peter, aren't you one of his disciples? Weren't you with him? And Peter said, well, I don't know him. Not me. 3 times. Peter said, no, I don't know him. Because he was afraid. Because Jesus had been taken away, and instead of Jesus rescuing himself with his own power, he was allowing himself to be, tortured and denigrated and restrained. And Peter didn't know what was going to happen. Would he be next? So he was frightened, and he tried to extricate himself from it. And then after the 3rd time, the rooster crowed. And all of a sudden, Peter remembered. Oh, just like, what an agonizing moment for the disciple. He remembered. But the other side of it was, Jesus knew. And so Peter had the comfort when he recovered. He had the comfort to know that Jesus knew. And he was always with me. He wasn't rejecting me because of this. He knew. And just to finish that story, after Jesus was crucified and then reappeared to his disciples, resurrected his body and reappeared to his disciples, he was walking by the Sea of Galilee with Peter and a few others. But he said to Peter, do you love me? Peter said, you know I love you, Lord. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Take care of my own. And then Jesus again said to Peter, do you love me? Peter said, Lord, you know I love you. Why do you ask? And then the 3rd time, Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? And Peter said, yes, Lord, I love you. So 3 times he denied Jesus. And then Jesus came back, and 3 times Jesus allowed Peter to affirm his relationship to Jesus. It's so breathtakingly beautiful, the divine romance. And there's heartache in it, that's the absolute truth. There's profound heartbreak in it, that's the absolute truth. Just today I pulled a little cardboard bookmark out of this book as it happened. And it turned out it was I don't know where I got it. It was a quote from Emily Dickinson, the poet. She said, if I can keep just one heart from breaking, my life will have been worthwhile. And of course, that's a beautiful sentiment, and the loving impulse she put behind it. But perhaps because it fell out of the Bhagavad Gita commentary, and perhaps it's just because vairagya has become an enormous part of my nature. Vairagya is kind of a disinclination for the world. Well, I'll shift this to another level. I was having a conversation with some of my peers some time ago, and 2 friends were actually talking to each other, and I was just listening to their conversation. They were talking about how they really just want, in their role within Ananda as leaders, they really just want people to be happy. And I know what they meant. What they meant was they want to give love to people and have people feel supported by their presence. And it was a deep comment from them. But it was also could be taken superficially, and I heard it more superficially than they said it. But it made me think to myself, it's not really enough just to be happy. What we really want to be is to be free. And to be free, I mean, in the context that we were talking here about energy has to flow unobstructed to the sea, it can't just trickle out from the pond. If it just trickles out from the pond, then we never gather enough strength to really reach the mountaintop. So our relationship with each other, by no means are we here to make each other unhappy. But what we really want is to be free. And it's a very powerful thought, because many times the heart has to break. And we can't be too deeply concerned about protecting ourselves and each other from pain. By no means should we inflict pain on each other, nor should we be cold-hearted when pain appears in ourselves or in other people, especially in other people. To be impersonal, as Swami said, means to be impersonal toward yourself, not to be cold toward others. This is where we go back earlier. To be cold in this world is not to be spiritual. But we also have to be calm. We have to be calm in the face of heartbreak, our own or the heartbreak of others. And by that, I don't mean that we never weep. There have been occasions in my life where I really understand how you fall to the floor weeping. I thought that was just a literary phrase. But I've actually discovered that it's not. You know, sometimes grief is overwhelming and you can't remain vertical. The calmness, therefore, is not superficial, because emotions, although they're intense, they happen on a more superficial level than where the soul resides. By their very nature, no matter how tumultuous, the tumultuous emotions of grief and disappointment and longing, and even of fulfillment that's based on external experiences, by definition happens at the surface of the ocean, where the waves are moving. It doesn't happen at the unchanging depths. So the calmness that we have is not that we never have an emotional response, or that we never have an intense emotional response. The calmness is the realization that the waves rise and fall. And Master was by no means indifferent to the sufferings of others. Swami talked about, it was either he himself or the story was told to him, finding Master in tears. And when the disciple inquired as to why Master was weeping, he spoke of one of the residents there. And he said, this man, he's going to leave the path. And Swami was there weeping for him, because Master was weeping, because Master knew the suffering now that this man would have to undergo, because he was turning his back on this opportunity, which was to be with Master and to follow through on his spiritual aspirations, and to gain the freedom that was potential in that incarnation. But instead, he was being drawn away, and Master was weeping for him, weeping for his heartbreak. But there was nothing Master could do to prevent it, because the disciple needed the experience. As I was saying earlier, Swami sometimes knew or tried to help us avoid a certain karma if he thought it was possible, or if he wanted us to have the comfort of knowing that Swami was with us from start to finish. That's how it comforts me. The fact that Swami, because there's been a number of times in my life when he said something that I didn't understand, even until years later, when other events unfolded. And then I realized he was hinting to me about what was going to happen. Swami talks about several times, because one of the great traumas of Swami's life was when he was expelled from Self-Realization Fellowship after Master's passing. And in retrospect, Swami realizes that in several different ways, Master hinted to him that this would happen, that he would be on his own. Master never said it directly to him, because Swami said it would have interfered with the necessary karmic flow. But he hinted so that Swami could be comforted later in knowing that Master knew. And I certainly have had the experience of Swami hinting, and then those hints becoming clear to me even decades later. Oh, he knew. He knew where I was going. He was with me every step of the way. So, coming back to that, just that little comment from Emily Dickinson, of course, if we can ease people's sufferings, that's the kind of desire that brings great joy to the heart. Because when we can act as an instrument of the Comforter, which is the Divine Mother, then we are fulfilling the whole purpose of our existence, which is to be an instrument for God. But God wants us to be free. Divine Mother wants us to be free. A good mother allows the child to cry if the child's desire is not going to really be beneficial. And a good mother thwarts the wrong impulses in the child in order to guide the child in the right direction. And so Divine Mother thwarts us. And it's not sad, it's poignant. It's very poignant. You see, all these things are so complicated. It's very, very poignant. Because it's not natural to not feel it on the level in which it also happens. But the calmness is behind all of this. I know it's taking me where I want to go. This is how I've really begun to think about everything that happens to me. I know where I'm going. And if God brings whatever experience He brings to me, it must be the route from here to there. Because He knows where I'm going. He's taking me there. It's sort of like being in a foreign country, and your guide takes you on a certain route through the city, and that he knows where he's taking you, and you just don't know. You've never been there before. It's all uncharted territory, and that just the more deeply. Well, the rest of what Swami says here about this first stanza of chapter 3, which I'm not going to now get to until the next session, is just all about navigating this line between the absolute certainty that divine realization is already ours and the labyrinth that we have to go through before we come back to the point that was always there, where it's just simply don't do it. Only devotion, experience, and grace. God bless you.